everybody. This is Dr. Jessica Friedman. Welcome to office hours. We are going to wait a little bit for everyone to get here, and then we will get started. I hope everyone is doing well. We certainly are in the full summer swing, I feel like. Graduations are happening, and people are really gearing up for summer. Here in New York, certainly everything is definitely opening up. We were also recently in Los Angeles, and things there are opening up as well. So it's very nice to see that all of us are, kind of moving back to normalcy. And I hope that all of you are doing this as well. So, if everyone could just sort of, type their questions into the chat, that would be awesome. And, I'm here to answer all of your questions. And just to introduce myself, for those of you who don't know who I am or who might be watching this recording later on, I am Dr. Jessica Friedman. I am the founder and chair of MedEdits Medical Admissions. And I recently got a question from somebody asking, are you a real doctor? And, I thought that was kind of funny, but I understood where that was coming from, because many people in our industry who do what I do and who do what my faculty do are not real doctors. So, obviously, PhDs are doctors too, but they're not medical doctors. So yes, I am an emergency physician, and I've worked in the community. I've also worked in academic settings, so this is part of what gives me such a broad base of experience, and also working with all of our students from many different backgrounds, with many different educational backgrounds, different demographics. All of that has also given me and my team a tremendous wealth of experience, and that we can so that we can guide students quite effectively. And that's a lot of what gives us our strength. So if everyone, can just sort of type in questions, that would be great. I'm just going to get started by answering a question that is posted in the chat. And then I'm also going to answer some questions that we've gotten online, because definitely a lot of people will watch these sessions, after they happen. So I was wondering, how do medical schools view pass-fail during COVID? And this is a common question. And if you had the option to take classes for a grade, it is preferred that you not be pass-fail. Okay, we've had situations where students have said, well, I didn't do well in this class, and so I'd rather it be pass-fail my transcript. But the medical schools will know if you had the option to earn grades. So if they see a pass-fail when they know that a grade was an option for you, then that is certainly going to raise eyebrows and raise some suspicion. So our recommendation is, if you have the option of earning grade versus being pass-fail, we recommend that you actually show your grades, you don't go pass-fail. Now, of course, there were some schools that did not give that option, right? That were only allowed their students to be pass-fail. And, of course, if that is your scenario, then that certainly will not be held against you. But what it will mean is that your other semesters in college are going to carry more weight, right? Because in essence, the semester that you were pass-fail kind of counts towards nothing. So that's also important to kind of recognize. I was wondering, how much does a paid medical summer camp at a mediocre medical school matter for BSMD for that same university? Okay, so Tanish, this is a really good question. And any type of paid summer camp is considered what we call pay to play. Okay, so you're paying to have the experience. Generally speaking, pay to play programs are not going to be viewed as favorably among admissions officers as experiences that maybe you got on your own. And this is certainly a trend that we are seeing at the undergraduate level. And it is a trend that we've seen, frankly, at the medical school admissions level. So there was definitely a time, for example, when international experiences were, very in vogue. And there were a whole bunch of companies that jumped on board with this, and frankly, that are still on board with this, and that have paid experiences for students to go abroad. And, granted, they're doing good work. A lot of these, companies, But from the admissions officer's perspective, it's very difficult to differentiate between, a program that's doing good and a program that is simply, sort of a for-profit program. So generally speaking, for-profit programs are not going to be looked upon as favorably. Now, Tanish, I would want to know, and you could type this into the chat, where this summer camp is. I'm really just curious, just because I certainly know a lot of it sounds like this is probably a high school summer program. I'm very curious to know where that summer program is. I know that there definitely is a very well-known, there's summer academies at Penn that are very well-known, but I'm just curious where that program is, because that also could, kind of impact things. Certainly there are some paid programs that are very selective, and and college admissions people know this, right? So like, for example, there's a program at BU that's very selective, that is, in the STEM area, and it is pay to play, but it's also a very selective program. So, that one is going to be looked upon more favorably versus a program where you just sign up and go, right? If you sort of just pay a fee and you go, this, generally speaking, is not going to look so great on a BSMD application, or a college application for that matter, since so many BSMD students are stellar students who are super motivated. Most of those students are also very competitive for selective undergraduate colleges, and oftentimes those students are kind of making those decisions. Do I want to select a BSMD program, or would I rather go to a more selective undergraduate college? And so certainly for the selective undergraduate colleges, college admissions is becoming as competitive as medical school admissions these days. And, for those, really, elite selective colleges, pay to play programs are not, really viewed all that well. Malihe, I'm sorry if I butchered your name, but so if it's just for one course, in some way, I think if it's just for one course, that's going to stand out even more, frankly, because basically, if you take pass fail for just one course, and every other course is you've earned a grade for that course, but only one course you're getting pass fail, that's basically saying I didn't do well in this class. So I mean, maybe superficially, I guess, that could keep your GPA up, especially if it's your BCPM GPA, if you're talking about, for screening factors. So frankly, I could see the logic in that, actually. If we were to calculate your GPAs and you were to sort of, with that course, be below a threshold, and without that course you would be above a threshold, I think you'd be communicating the same thing to the admissions officers. So maybe, if I'm just sort of thinking about this logically, if you were to put one bad grade on your transcript that you otherwise could have a pass fail for, and that's going to keep you from, let's say, one of those 0.5 or a 0.1 marks, below or above it, so like, a 3.5 versus a 3.47, might get you screened out some places. So we would really want to know those numbers. This is called Med Academy at Cooper, at Rowan, and they have a BSMD and a BSDO. There was an application process with essays. So if the acceptance rate was approximately 30%, that is a competitive program. And I would try to find out from the program. And actually, I haven't heard of this program, so I'm going to look it up because I'm curious about it. Tanisha, if you want to email us, info@mededits.com, and after this, maybe tomorrow, and just follow up with me, because I'm curious about this program. I'll look it up and I'll tell you my thoughts about it. But if it is a selective program with a 30% acceptance rate, this might be something that would be worthwhile doing, especially for Cooper specifically. So sometimes students will take the strategy for college admissions where they might do a program that is selective, and they obviously, Cooper would know about it, the BSMD programs would know about it, but you might not list it on your Common App. That is also another strategy that students take. So with the Common App, it's a very different application process than the medical school application process, because with the Common App, you only have 10 spaces to enter your extracurricular and scholarly experiences. So it leaves you, less space to list. So you can kind of cherry pick which experiences you want to list in that Common App. So that would also be another strategy. From Rachel, what is the AdCom perspective and upward trend in grades, specifically regarding STEM grades from a more rigorous institution? This is looked upon very favorably, Rachel. So, you know, no one expects you to have a brilliant academic performance your freshman year. If you do, wonderful. But most people are adjusting to college life. They're figuring out how to study. They're figuring out how to get things done when they have, you know, so many more distractions than they had when they were sitting at home, and they don't have their parents bugging them. And, you know, you're making friends, you're getting settled, you're figuring out where your space is in your undergraduate institution. So many students, you know, do not do well freshman year, certainly. You would not be alone if you didn't do well freshman year. And upward trends are looked upon very favorably. Again, you want to try to have that GPA that is going to potentially meet thresholds. Those thresholds are going to be different at different institutions. Every school has sort of a different formula for how they determine those thresholds. You know, is it a combination of MCAT and GPA? Is it, you know, is there an absolute number where they want you to reach for both MCAT and GPA, and most medical schools will not disclose this, but all medical schools do screen to some degree. So as long as that upward trend is also, you know, when you're doing your GPAs, that they're not, you know, very low, and they're, you know, they're above 3.5 or even 3.6. I mean, everything in med school admissions is trending upwards. You know, we used to say if you had a 509 to 510, you know, that was a really strong MCAT score. But, you know, the average MCAT score now for allopathic medical schools in the United States is 511.4. So, you know, we definitely feel safer now when students have above a 511. I mean, just because things are just becoming more competitive. So, you know, really the same thing goes with GPA as well. I found this document from ANCAS, and most medical schools say they accept pass-fail, but is there sort of a bias involved? Yeah, great question. So, of course, medical schools accept pass-fail, but yes, there's going to be a bias. So, you know, the only way that a medical school can determine, you know, what kind of student you are is by looking at your grades and by looking at your MCAT. So, you know, of course, if you're at a university that only offers pass-fail, it's not going to be held against you. Usually the universities that do offer that are very prestigious universities. So, you know, those students already sort of have a bit of an advantage in the process. But, you know, whenever you are offered the option of pass-fail versus grades, the medical schools want to see the grades. Also, my GPA would be a 3.85 CUME and a 3.7 science. That's really good with a 519 MCAT. My GPA is from a top public university. What medical school should I apply to? Well, these are great numbers. So if you have a 3.7, you have a 519, that puts you in a great position. In terms of what medical schools to apply to, we do have an article on this to help you kind of figure out making a school list. And making a good school list is absolutely crucial to every student's success in this process. One of the biggest mistakes that we see when we work with reapplicants is that they did not choose their school list wisely, you know, and no fault of their own, they didn't sort of know how to choose those schools wisely. So in choosing your school list, we would want to know your state residency, first of all, just because for most students, the state from which they're from, applying to those medical schools is always smart. Some states have, you know, medical schools that are easier to get into, and some have not many state medical schools at all, or they're very competitive. So certainly there are some states that are, quote, good to be from for med school admissions, and others that are more difficult to be from. So we would want to know your state residency. We definitely want you applying to those schools. And then we would want you looking at schools where the combination of your MCAT and your GPA, you know, are within, let's say, the 50th percentile. Okay, so like right in the middle or above. And those sort of become the metrics that will largely determine, you know, whether you're going to be screened in to be interviewed, right? And that's when the sort of more subjective criteria come into play. So your experiences, and that comes down to your research, your scholarly experiences, your community service, your clinically related experiences, your letters of recommendation, and, you know, and how you write about all of these things in your written documents. So the more subjective criteria are the things that then will decide if you are getting an interview or not getting an interview. So MedEdit students, we find, definitely get more interviews than their numbers alone would suggest that they could get. And this is just because we really help students to express themselves fully. We never write students' documents. We never tell them what they should write, but we sort of extract that information from them. So they write about their experiences very thoughtfully and in depth. And so it then becomes the subjective criteria that will sort of determine whether or not the reviewer thinks that you're worthy of an interview at that institution. But certainly with a 3.7 GPA from a top public university and a 519 on the MCAT, you know, that's really terrific. I'm thinking if, you know, you're Jersey, like maybe that's Rutgers, you know, which of course is a great school. And especially, you know, if you're in their honors program as well, that's also a very prestigious program. You know, so another myth that we often try to dispel is that you have to go to a top college in order to get into a great medical school. And this simply just is not the case. Earning a really high GPA and a very high MCAT from a state school, from a public university, from a school that maybe isn't considered, you know, top 10, you know, on US News and World Report, you know, assuming that you do all the right things, you know, extracurricularly and from a scholarly standpoint. You know, we have students from, you know, all different types of colleges in terms of prestige who are getting into great medical schools. So that's also important to know. Since current high school class of 2022 had their junior year completely virtual, how are grades from this year viewed compared to previous years? Especially, is there a strong uptrend throughout the years, especially if there's a strong uptrend? So, I mean, the issue is, you know, is that yes, for this year's current juniors, rising seniors, you had about a year and a half online. And it was very, very difficult. So everything is going to be looked at within the context of what your experience was, right? Ultimately, for high school students, this comes down to comparing you to others in your high school class. Okay, so when I'm thinking about college admissions, I'm not just thinking about things on a global scale or let's say a national scale, but I'm thinking of things in sort of, you know, the microcosm of your individual high school. So you are going to be compared from other students at your high school. So like, let's say everybody else at your high school got straight A's and you got all B pluses. Well, maybe you had a tougher time with COVID, and you didn't do as well with remote learning, but the bottom line is there are other students who did okay with remote learning. So is a college or a BSMD program going to take a risk on a student that maybe had a tougher time, or are they going to go with the student who was able to perform under duress? And probably they're going to go with that student who was able to perform under duress. So, you know, that's kind of the reality of the situation. You know, even with COVID and, you know, test cancellations and everything else, there are plenty of students at the high school level who still have those, you know, unbelievably high GPAs. And I'm astonished, frankly, by, you know, all the different grading scales that exist at different high schools. And just how high people's GPAs are. So all of this has to be looked at within the context of your college. And most colleges give you access to that data, you know, through Naviance and other things like that. So I would recommend looking at that data and talking to your college counselors at your high school, who can then, you know, kind of give you a sense of where you place within your class. And also most high schools also do rankings as well. Sorry, we're talking a lot about high school BSMD today. It sort of always varies what we talk about. How do med schools view having multiple scientific publications? Do they care about which journal the article was published in if you are a first author? The med schools probably do. The med schools, and you know, again, we don't look at this like, what do the med schools think, right? We look at this in terms of, what does the individual reviewer who's looking at your application, what do they know about that journal, right? So it's not as if there's some sort of, you know, robot in the sky, you know, every med school that's just sort of like looking at these applications. There is a tremendous amount of bias that goes on, and every reviewer obviously looks at an application through their lens and their understanding, right? So when you're, for example, being reviewed, you might be being reviewed by a primary care physician who works in the community primarily, who doesn't know anything about, journals beyond JAMA or something. And so they might be really impressed by, the International Journal of Obscurity and Biochemistry, right? So again, it's sort of, having a publication is impressive. I can tell you that the college admissions officers probably know less about publication status, assuming you're not talking about like New England Journal or Nature or something like that, the very well-known journals. So it really depends. Obviously, having a publication is going to be impressive to most people. And I think, you will be, cut some slack if you have a publication, regardless of where that publication is. Also, this does not mean you must have publications. We work with many students who just did not have luck getting a publication. Everyone understands that getting published often is a factor of luck and what your results are in the lab or in the clinical setting or wherever that might be. So if you don't have a publication, don't think that you're doomed. That is hardly the case. We work with the majority of our students with whom we work who get into medical school are not published. Okay, how much does undergrad prestige matter? For example, a 75th ranked school nationally versus a 40th ranked school nationally. Again, this is a great question. I would want to know what those schools are. If you can tell me what those schools are, I do like to know names, but again, we really don't care a lot about rankings. I mean, we've worked with students who, go to schools that are in the top 10 in terms of US News and World Report ranking. We work with students who go to more like 75th, percent or 75th in the rankings by US News. We try not to pay attention to those rankings. It really does not predict overall outcomes. Now, if you're applying to medical school from like a really, a top 5 university, is that medical school going to assume that you're smart and you probably had a pretty stellar high school record to get in there? Absolutely, they are. But does that mean that student doesn't have to prove themselves? No, that student still has to prove herself the same way the student who goes to the 75th ranked college needs to prove herself. Sometimes by going to a university or a college that isn't as highly ranked, sometimes you have more opportunities at those schools too. So, as long as you're challenging yourself, you're taking a rigorous curriculum, you're doing well academically, you're getting involved in research and everything else you need to be involved in, and you're doing super well on the MCAT, that then becomes the great equalizer, right? The issue that we find is when, let's say we have a student who went to a not very well-known undergraduate college, and they got straight A's, and then they take the MCAT and they get a 500. Well, okay, then maybe that 4.0 from that college doesn't mean as much as we might have assumed if the student got a 522, right? So, the MCAT becomes the great equalizer. So that's also something to realize. Okay. Is it worth going to Rutgers, which is $15,000 versus NYU for undergrad if you plan on applying to med school? I'd say it's worth going to Rutgers. That's a lot of money. We work with great Rutgers students who do very well in this process. If that were me, I would not, unless you really wanted to go to NYU because you wanted to be in the city, it was your dream school, money was no factor. If that were my child, I don't know. I wouldn't be encouraging them to go to NYU for that significant amount of money, honestly. And that's a lot of money. So, I mean, that's 65, that's times 4, that's a lot. You can do super well at Rutgers. I'm also curious, Tanisha, if this is the honors program at Rutgers, which is a great program. Okay. With a 512 and a 3.8 GPA, top public university, what are the chances of getting admitted? Do you recommend to include DO in the list? This is a good profile. So a 512 is a completely solid score. The 3.8 is wonderful. And from a top public university, so I'm assuming you took rigorous courses. It would depend on what your experiences were, how strong your experience profile was. Is your experience profile, does it make you a better applicant, or does it sort of just, does it keep you at the 512, in other words? Like, so sometimes an extracurricular profile elevates a student. It rarely deflates a student unless that student, let's say, has phenomenal over the top grades and the extracurricular record is just bleh. But rarely does an extracurricular profile deflate. So if your extracurricular profile inflates you, as well as your letters of recommendation, I would not necessarily say that you had to apply to osteopathic medical schools. The other question that we always ask our students when they're kind of, in that middle range of competitiveness is we say, well, how would you feel going to an osteopathic school? And would you rather see if you get in this year, give it your best shot, and then if you have to reapply, you add on osteopathic medical schools in the reapplication, right? So this is always kind of, something that we present to our students because it isn't such an easy decision. If you get accepted to medical school, you go. So you don't sort of want to apply to osteopathic medical schools thinking, well, maybe I'll go, maybe I won't. It's once you have a med school acceptance, it's very tough to turn down. Certainly with a 3.8 and a 512, you're getting into osteopathic medical school. So you really need to ask yourself the question, would I rather reapply next year or would I rather, apply to, osteopathic as a backup? So that's something to think about. When is the best time to start applying to medical schools? Also, which year should I be taking the MCAT? Is there a number of times you recommend? So in the ideal world, you take the MCAT once, you do really well on it, and you are done, okay? Many students, I don't know if it's most, I don't know the data on this off the top of my head. Many students have to take the MCAT twice, right? When you start taking the MCAT 3 times, it's starting to look a little bit like you're kind of throwing darts at a dartboard, okay? So what we recommend is if a student doesn't do well in the MCAT the first time, they really figure out, okay, what do I need to do to bump my score? Where did I go wrong? What sections am I weak on? Where does my target studying need to be? And you really bump it on the second attempt, okay? You should spend at least 3 months studying for the MCAT, at least. So when applications to medical school are submitted in late May, okay? The latest that we recommend taking the MCAT, the year you're applying, is in June, all right? If you wanna be super safe, you try to take the MCAT in the fall before you're applying or in the spring before you're applying so that you know what your score is when you're submitting your application. We have a very good timeline article, which covers all of this. So I would encourage you to read that as well. And which year you should be taking the MCAT, you want to think about, well, when do you plan on applying? Most schools will take MCAT scores up to 3 years old, but some will only take scores up to 2 years old. So you want to kind of figure out, when am I taking the MCAT relative to when do I plan to apply to medical school? That's important. You also want to think about what other experiences you want to have before you apply to medical school. So medical school admissions is definitely becoming about more than just numbers. Med schools are loving practical clinical experience these days. It doesn't matter, you have to have that. We still work with, juniors every year who apply to medical school at the end of junior year, who are accepted, who go to great schools. But we're seeing, more and more students who are taking gap years, at least one gap year before they're applying to medical school. Okay, let me just see. I hope that answered your question, but you should look at the timeline article. How do U.S. med schools view students applying from Canadian undergrads? You are considered an international student. They look upon you favorably. It's just tougher, right? There just aren't as many slots for international students. We've worked with some, international students who do great. I mean, certainly they're more comfortable, taking Canadians who went to US schools. Again, this is more about the individual reading the application, like, what are they comfortable with? So I wouldn't sort of, say it's about what are med schools comfortable with. It's more about the individual who's reviewing your application. What are they comfortable with? Naviance doesn't show BSMD programs. What is another way to find out stats for people who get into BSMD programs from your school? You would have to ask your college counselor at your school if they have that data. Obviously, the number of students who are applying to BSMD programs from any given high school is a very small number, but they might have that data. That's pretty tough data to get your hands on, frankly. You could also look at the MSAR. The MSAR is going to tell you for each medical school class what number of students are coming from the BSMD program. Okay, so for example, if you were to look at, Missouri, Kansas City, you know, many students are coming to their medical school class from their BSMD program. So you would want to look at the MSAR to see exactly what number that is. And that can sort of give you a sense, but it's going to be very tough to figure out, you know, what stats those students have, to be honest. Okay, I wanted to ask you a timeline of applications. I've heard so much about the importance of applying early. Life got in the way and I submitted on June 19th. Great, June 19th is a great date to submit your application. Tomorrow is the first day that MCAS applications, verified MCAS applications, are going to be sent to medical schools. What that means is that next week, medical schools will start to release, maybe even this weekend, will start to release their secondary applications. As soon as those secondary applications are released, the prompts start appearing on Student Doctor Network and on Reddit, okay? So what I recommend you do is, for all the schools you apply to, you go find those secondary prompts for this year and you start working on them. And that way, when you are verified, let's say by the end of July, your secondary essays are all done and you're just literally just hitting the submit button on them. On time would, you know, earlier is always better. You know, so we say, look, if you're ready to submit as soon as AMCAS opens, which I think was May 27th this year, terrific. But life gets in the way for a lot of people and that just doesn't happen. And, you know, if you're talking about submitting in August, we generally don't recommend that. We generally say, you know what, it's probably better to apply next year. But when we're talking about a June submission date for our students for medical school, we're fine with that. And we, you know, even later. I am an upcoming senior. I have a 1480 SAT at 3.65, strong upward trend. I have really good ECs. Is that, I was told that ECs don't matter for HP. I don't know what HP is. Is that true? I would love to see a little bit higher on the SAT. You know, a 1520 is sort of the ballpark number we like to see for students who are applying to really competitive programs. Does it mean that a 1480 isn't good enough? No, it could be, depending on everything else, but I would like to see that bumped a bit more. You should consider, depending on what else you have going on this summer, studying all summer, taking the August SAT, or taking it in the fall, just because that will put you in a different grouping if you can bump over a 1500 on the SAT. Okay. We're almost out of time. Let me answer a couple more questions. How important is doing an away rotation for the specialty you're interested in for residency applications? Does it significantly change your chance of matching? Christabel, fabulous question. It depends on the specialty, okay? It also depends on when you are applying, all right? And so that's sort of a two-part question. So if you, for example, are applying for a specialty in, you know, ENT, ophthalmology, orthopedic surgery, something super duper competitive, those away rotations really, really matter, right? Because a lot of times matching those specialties is about relationship building. It's about letters of recommendation. Generally speaking, away rotations are not as important for some of the bigger specialties like internal medicine, family medicine, pediatrics. Now, the USMLE, the United States Medical Licensing Exam, is going pass-fail next year in 2022. So it's going to be interesting to see if away rotations become important for all specialties in medicine. Okay, we really don't know the answer to that yet, but an away rotation, the importance of that away rotation is really going to depend on the specialty you're pursuing. Okay. Yeah. Okay. First time applicant, no gap year, got 3 interviews, all 3 on the wait list. It is already June 3rd week. Do you think we still have a chance? It's June 20th. Okay. I understand. It's getting late. If you haven't reapplied, you're in the Rutgers Honor Program. This is terrific. It's a great program. Okay. Sorry, I digress. If you haven't already applied this year, I would want to find out what you've done this year to improve your candidacy. Were you a junior? And, you know, did you, was this your senior year in college? What do you have planned for next year? It's definitely getting late. If you're not off a wait list yet, that window is closing. That said, do we work with students every year who get off the wait list in July? Yes, absolutely. So we will start working with students, on a reapplication in June, and they're on wait lists, and they get off in July. So anything is possible, but you certainly need to be planning for reapplication and kind of realizing that's realistic. Now, what I would want to know is if you had 3 interviews and those 3 interviews all converted to wait lists, this suggests to me that there was something with the interview performance or the interview experience that could be improved upon. So if you were to work with us, this is something that we would really want to investigate. And we would want to find out, well, why didn't at least one of those convert to an acceptance? Because those are sort of numbers that we're not used to seeing. If students get that many interviews and they're not getting acceptances, then it suggests to us that there's something that is being communicated in the interview, whether that's verbally or just, cues or body language or something. There's something the interviewer is picking up on that maybe they're not so comfortable with. So we would want to try to get to the bottom of that. Okay. All right. I'm going to answer one more question. Just because it is getting late. Is it hard to become an anesthesiologist when going the DO path? If so, how hard? Anesthesiology is definitely a competitive specialty. I would need to look at the data because all of the residency data, we have to go to the NRMP, the National Residency Matching Program, and we need to look specifically at that data. And we need to look, for example, at anesthesiology. Well, how many MD seniors are graduating or going into anesthesia, and how many osteopathic seniors are graduating and going into that field. So I don't want to give you an answer without really looking at that data. That data is publicly available, so you certainly can find it. But definitely going into a more competitive specialty is more difficult from an osteopathic medical school. So but look at the data. Also, if you're, for example, looking at Rowan, look at Rowan's match list, right? So, where are their students matching? And that's going to give you a lot of information as well. Anyway, so I want to thank all of you for tuning in tonight. Please tune in again next week. And these were great questions. And I also love the fact that we covered all the bases tonight. So we covered, undergrad, BSMD, med school, residency. The only thing we didn't cover was fellowship. So this really sort of represents who we are and what we're about, because we are about the continuum of medical education, and we work with students the whole way through. And that's what I love so much about the work that we do. So thank you so much, and please tune in next week. And and we would, if you have any other lingering questions, please feel free to email info@mededits.com and just write attention, Dr. Friedman. Thank you so much, and sign up for a free 15-minute consultation. I see the link in the chat there, and we hope to see you again.